For 2 decades, the town of Havenwood, Maine, spoke of its lost choir in hushed, sorrowful tones. 18 young voices silenced after a late-night rehearsal in 1963. The official story was a tragic bus accident on a flooded road, but no bus was ever found. Ansel Thorne, whose older sister Cora sang soprano, never accepted that story. He spent his life haunted by the town's collective shrug, the too quick acceptance of a tragedy with no evidence. Now, a peat harvester working the acidic depths of the Black Meadow Bog has pulled a perfectly preserved hymn book from the mire, its cover embossed with the church's crest and a single name inside: Cora Thorne. It's strange how a single object can shatter a silence that has lasted for 20 years. Before you hear Ansel's story, take a moment to think if there's an unsolved mystery in your own town's past, and let me know in the comments what you think really happened. The year was 1983, and for Ansel Thorne, it might as well have still been 1963. At 38, he was a carpenter, his hands calloused and strong, but his spirit felt worn down, weathered by a grief that had never been allowed to properly heal. He lived alone in the small house he and Cora had grown up in, the walls holding the faint echoes of her laughter and the scent of the lemon polish she used on the old piano. He'd never left Havenwood, a town nestled between dense pine forests and sprawling misty bogs. Leaving felt like abandoning her, like agreeing with the town's verdict: a terrible accident, a case closed by time and sorrow. But Ansel knew better. He was 18 the night Cora disappeared. He remembered the rain, a steady, dreary drizzle, not the raging storm the official report described. He remembered the road they said the bus had washed off of, Creek Road, and how it never flooded badly enough to swallow a vehicle whole without a trace. The whole story felt thin, like a poorly patched blanket that couldn't cover the cold, hard truth beneath. The town, however, seemed desperate to believe it. It was easier to mourn a tragedy than to confront a mystery. Easier than asking why the choir director, Matthias Croft, the last man to see them, was so quick to accept the accident theory. Easier than questioning why the sheriff at the time, a good man named Brody, was quietly forced into early retirement just months later. So Ansel lived with the silence, a solitary man in a town that had moved on. His life was a quiet protest against their forgetting. He kept Cora's room just as she'd left it, her sheet music still on the piano, a pair of her shoes tucked neatly under the bed. It was his private memorial, a place where the official story held no power. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. It was the new sheriff, a young man named Peterson who barely had any memory of the event itself. "Ansel," he said, his voice hesitant, "you might want to come down to the Black Meadow Bog. The peat company, they found something." Ansel's heart hammered against his ribs. The Black Meadow Bog was a vast, desolate wetland on the edge of town, a place where the ground was a sponge of decaying life going back centuries. It was also less than a mile from the old logging road that branched off Creek Road. When Ansel arrived, the air was thick with the earthy smell of freshly cut peat. A small group of workers stood around a muddy pit, their faces grim. Sheriff Peterson met him at the yellow tape. "A machine pulled it up about an hour ago," he said, leading Ansel to a portable table where an object lay covered in a plastic sheet. "The peat preserved it. It's remarkable." Peterson lifted the sheet. There, resting on the sterile surface, was a black, leather-bound hymn book. It was swollen with water, but otherwise intact. The acidic, oxygen-starved environment of the bog had kept it from rotting away. On the cover, the gold leaf cross of the Havenwood Community Church was still visible. Ansel didn't need to look inside. He knew. But Peterson opened it anyway, his gloved fingers carefully turning the stiff pages to the inside cover. In elegant, familiar handwriting, a name was written: Cora Thorne. A tremor went through Ansel's body. 20 years of numb, directionless grief suddenly sharpened into a single point of focus. This wasn't just an object. It was a voice from the mire, a clue that had refused to stay buried. "There was no bus accident," Ansel said, his voice low and steady, more certain than he'd ever been. "And this proves it. This book didn't get here by itself." Sheriff Peterson nodded slowly, looking from the book to Ansel's determined face. The state police have been notified, he said. They're treating it as new evidence in a cold case. But Ansel knew how state police worked. They'd see it as a curiosity, a footnote to a forgotten tragedy. They hadn't lived with the silence. They hadn't felt the wrongness of it all in their bones for 2 decades. I'm going to find out what happened, Ansel declared, his gaze fixed on his sister's name, with or without their help. He finally had a place to start, a thread to pull, and he would pull it until the whole town's carefully woven lie unraveled. Ansel took the hymn book home, handling it as if it were the most fragile artifact on earth. After letting it dry slowly for days between sheets of blotting paper, he began to examine it. Most of the pages were stuck together, the ink blurred into watercolor ghosts. But on the very last page, a blank in paper, he saw something. A faint indentation, almost invisible. He angled it under a lamp, his breath held tight. It was a small, hastily drawn sketch. It looked like a simple box, a shipping crate, and on its side was a simple 3-pointed symbol, a pine tree. It meant nothing to him, but Cora had drawn it. That had to mean something. His first stop wasn't the sheriff's office. It was a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods where former Sheriff Brody now lived out his days. Brody was in his 70s, his face a roadmap of regrets. He was wary when Ansel arrived, but his eyes softened when he saw the hymn book. I knew it, Brody whispered, running a trembling finger over the cover. I knew that Axton's story was a lie. He told Ansel how his investigation had been shut down from above. State officials, the town mayor, even the owner of the local timber mill, they had all pressured him to close the case. They said I was upsetting the families, stirring up false hope, Brody recalled, his voice bitter. They ran me out of my own job. Who was the last person to see them? Ansel asked, though he already knew the answer. Matthias Croft, Brody confirmed. The choir director said he saw them off on the bus for a church retreat in Bangor. Said he waved them goodbye right from the church steps. Ansel then asked about Croft's connections. He was always well respected, Brody said, but he had friends in high places. He managed the timber mill's export logistics on the side. Said it was a favor for the owner. Always seemed odd for a man of the cloth to be dealing with shipping manifests and coastal freighters. Ansel felt a jolt. Shipping. A pine tree. The timber mill. He showed Brody the sketch from the hymn book. Brody squinted at it. That's the old logo for the Havenwood Timber Mill, he said instantly. They stopped using it years ago, but that was their mark back in '63. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a picture Ansel didn't want to see. His next visit was to the man himself. Matthias Croft lived in the largest house in Havenwood, a pristine colonial on a hill overlooking the town he had spiritually guided for decades. He was in his late 60s now, with a mane of white hair and a kind, grandfatherly face. He greeted Ansel at the door with a warm, sad smile, as if he'd been expecting him. Ansel, my boy, I heard about what they found. A miracle and a tragedy all at once. He ushered Ansel into a study lined with books. Ansel placed the hymn book on the polished mahogany desk between them. Croft looked at it, his eyes filled with a performer's sorrow. Poor Cora. Such a beautiful voice. Silence too soon. You were the last one to see them, Ansel said, his tone even. Croft nodded solemnly. I was. I prayed with them before they left. The driver was a good man from the next town over. The rain was getting bad. I wish I'd told them to wait until morning. It was a perfect performance, but Ansel wasn't an impressionable member of his congregation. Sheriff Brody told me you used to handle shipping for the timber mill, Ansel said, watching Croft's face carefully. For the briefest of moments, the kindly mask slipped. A flicker of something hard, something cold, passed through Croft's eyes before being replaced by a gentle, dismissive chuckle. Oh, that. Yes, I help them out with some paperwork now and then, a bit of Christian charity to help a local business. Did their crates have a pine tree logo on them? Ansel pressed. Croft's smile tightened. I believe they did. Ansel, what are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Ansel replied, standing up. I'm just trying to understand why my sister would draw the logo of a timber mill in her hymn book on the night she disappeared. He left Croft sitting in his study, the benevolent mask firmly back in place, but Ansel had seen the truth behind it. He had seen the flicker of a predator startled from its slumber. Driven by a new, cold certainty, Ansel went to the town's small library, which housed the local historical archives. He spent hours poring over dusty newspaper articles and town records from 1963. He found what he was looking for in the business section of the Havenwood Chronicle, a small article announcing a new export partnership between the Havenwood Timber Mill and a distribution company based in Canada. The article praised the deal, put together by the mill's civic-minded logistics manager, Mr. Matthias Croft, for bringing new prosperity to the town. Ansel dug deeper looking for shipping manifests. He found records for the weeks leading up to the choir's disappearance. The manifests were for lumber, just as Croft had said. But something was off. The weight of the shipments was listed as far heavier than what the volume of lumber would suggest, and the shipments were always at night, always from a disused pier down the coast, and always on trucks that weren't from the mill's official fleet. He was looking at a ghost operation, running right under the town's nose. The pine tree crates weren't just carrying lumber. They were carrying something much heavier, something much more valuable. And whatever it was, Matthias Croft was in the middle of it. The bus accident wasn't a cover-up for a simple tragedy. It was a cover-up for a crime. His sister and her friends hadn't died in an accident. They had been silenced because they saw something they weren't supposed to see. Ansel returned to Sheriff Brody's cabin, his hands shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. He laid out the business records and shipping manifests on the old man's kitchen table. Brody stared at them, his face pale. Smuggling, he breathed. Of course. Rum runners used this coast for decades. Croft must have modernized the operation. He looked up at Ansel, his eyes filled with a 20-year-old shame. There's something I never told anyone, Brody confessed, his voice cracking. I held it back to protect myself, my family. After the official search was called off, I kept looking on my own. I went back to the area around the bog, near that old logging road. He walked over to a locked footlocker in the corner of the room and pulled out a small, rust-eaten piece of metal. I found this, snagged on a tree root about 50 yards into the bog, he said, placing it in Ansel's hand. It was a fragment of a license plate. It matches the plate series for the church bus. The final piece clicked into place. The bus hadn't crashed on Creek Road. It had been driven down the abandoned logging road, a road that led directly to the deepest, most inaccessible part of the Black Meadow Bog. Ansel knew what he had to do. He looked at the old sheriff. Where is that spot exactly? Brody drew him a map on a napkin, his hand trembling but sure. No one has been down that road in 50 years, he warned. The bog has probably reclaimed it. Ansel folded the map and put it in his pocket. The bog can't keep a secret forever, he said. He grabbed a shovel and a heavy-duty flashlight from his truck and headed for the woods, toward a place the town had chosen to forget. The logging road was barely a whisper of a path, choked by 2 decades of undergrowth. Ansel pushed through thorny bushes and tangled vines, the bog sucking at his boots with every step. Using Brody's map, he found the old oak tree that marked the spot. The ground here was different, unnaturally soft and spongy. He began to dig. The work was exhausting. The wet, heavy soil fought him, but he was driven by a desperate energy. After an hour, his shovel struck something hard with a sickening metallic clang. He cleared away the mud and leaves, his heart pounding. It was metal, painted yellow. The roof of the old church bus. It had been here the whole time, swallowed by the earth. Waiting. He didn't call Sheriff Peterson. Not yet. This moment belonged to him, to Cora, to the 17 other lost souls. He drove straight back to town, mud-caked and breathing hard, and went directly to the grand house on the hill. He found Matthias Croft in his garden, pruning roses. I found it, Ansel said, his voice raw. I found the bus. Croft froze, the pruning shears still in his hand. The kindly mask didn't just slip, it shattered. The face that looked back at Ansel was cold, reptilian, stripped of all pretense. "You should have left it alone, boy," Croft hissed. He gestured for Ansel to follow him inside, into the same pristine study. "They weren't supposed to be there," Croft began, his voice calm, detached, as he poured 2 glasses of brandy. He didn't offer one to Ansel. "The rehearsal ended early. I was overseeing a shipment at the old mill. The choir, they took a shortcut through the woods on their way home. They saw it all. Crates of untaxed Canadian liquor. They saw my face. They saw the mill owner's face." He took a long sip of his brandy. "They were good kids, but they were witnesses. We couldn't have that. My associate and I, we couldn't let our entire operation, our life's work, be ruined by a group of nosy teenagers." He described it with chilling clarity, how they rounded up the terrified choir, forced them back onto their bus at gunpoint, and drove them down the forgotten logging road. There was no struggle. Just the silent, wide-eyed terror of children facing down 2 men they had trusted their entire lives. "We just drove it into the bog," Croft said with a shrug. "It sank faster than I expected. We told everyone it was a tragic accident on Creek Road. And this town, this gullible, faithful town, they believed us. It was cleaner that way." As he finished his story, a faint smile played on his lips. "And now you know. Which makes you a witness, too." From a drawer in his desk, he pulled out a small, silver pistol, its barrel gleaming in the lamplight. "It's a shame. I always liked you, Ansel." But just as he raised the gun, the study door burst open. Sheriff Peterson stood there, his own weapon drawn, with 2 deputies behind him. Old Man Brody stood just behind them, his face grim but vindicated. He had followed Ansel, fearing the worst, and had called the new sheriff on his way. Croft's face contorted in disbelief and rage as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. His reign was over. The recovery took weeks. They brought in heavy machinery to pull the rusted shell of the bus from the bog's grip. Inside, they found the remains of 18 people, their young lives cut short and buried in the mud. Havenwood was shattered. The town had to face the monster it had revered as a saint, and the terrible truth it had been too comfortable to question. They held a funeral, a real one this time, for the lost choir. 18 new headstones stood in the church cemetery. Ansel stood before Cora's, the cold Maine air biting at his cheeks. He placed her hymn book, now dry and preserved, at the base of the stone. The weight he had carried for 20 years, the crushing weight of the unknown, was finally gone. It wasn't replaced by happiness, but by a quiet, settled peace. He had not rested until he brought his sister and all the others home. What do you think is worse, the evil act itself, or the community that chooses to look away and accept a comfortable lie for decades? It's a tough question, but one worth thinking about. If this story made you reflect, I hope you'll consider subscribing and joining our community. We explore these complex human stories every week, and we'd be honored to have you with us.